There is a scene that happens over and over in Adventure Time, so often that you stop noticing it after a while, the way you stop noticing a clock ticking in a room you've lived in for years. Finn is upset. Something has gone wrong, or something is about to go wrong, or the world is ending. In whatever specific and often absurd way, the world tends to end in the land of Oo. And Jake, the yellow dog stretched out on the couch, or halfway into a sandwich, or lying upside down for no reason anyone has ever demanded, he explained, says something. It is never a long speech. It is never delivered with the weight of wisdom. It usually comes out sideways, half a joke, sometimes wrong in the specific details, and somehow, almost every time, it is the exact thing that needed saying. That is the whole mystery of Jake the dog compressed into one recurring moment, and it is the mystery this video is going to spend a very long time inside of. Because here is the strange thing about Jake, the thing that takes years of sitting with the show to really see. He looks, from a distance, like the funny one, the lazy one, the dog who would rather nap than adventure, who loves food with an intensity that borders on the religious, who gives advice that is technically incorrect about 90% of the time, and yet somehow lands anyway. He is not the hero of Adventure Time in the way Finn is the hero. He does not carry a sword. He does not have a destiny written into the stars in the shape of a blue comet. He is, by every surface measurement, the comic relief standing next to the actual protagonist. And that reading of Jake is not wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that becomes more obvious the longer you watch, the same way a familiar room reveals more of itself, the longer you sit quietly inside it without reaching to turn on the lights. Because underneath the naps and the sandwiches and the terrible advice about girls being like horses, there is a person who has actually done something most of the characters around him have not done. He has made peace. Not with everything, not perfectly, but genuinely, with the specific things that tend to break people: change, mortality, the gap between who you were and who you're becoming, the knowledge that everyone you love is going to leave eventually, one way or another, and that the only real choice you get is how you spend the time before that happens. Jake worked that out, not through study, not through discipline, not through anything you could put in a self-help book. He worked it out the way dogs work things out, by living through it, by getting it wrong 100 times, and eventually landing somewhere that felt right and just staying there. This is a video about how he got there, about the criminal who became a father, about the son who found out his real father was something closer to a parasite, about the dog who watched himself turn into an alien and had to decide, in the middle of that transformation, who he actually was underneath the shape he happened to be wearing, about the friend who spent years slowly, quietly preparing another person to survive without him, because somewhere in that stretchy, food-obsessed, endlessly relaxed body, Jake understood something that took the show's other characters a very long time to learn. Everything ends, and the ending doesn't have to be the point, so settle in. This one goes deep, and it goes for a while, and there is no reason to rush through it. Let's start with the part everyone already knows, because it turns out even the part everyone knows has more in it than people usually notice. Jake the dog is voiced by John DiMaggio, an actor from North Plainfield, New Jersey, who is probably better known to a slightly older generation of viewers as the voice of Bender on Futurama. DiMaggio has a particular kind of voice, gravelly and warm at the same time, the voice of someone who could plausibly have been in a bar fight and also plausibly be the first person to check on you afterward. It is, if you think about it for more than a second, a strange voice to put inside a small yellow dog. And yet, it works so completely that it is hard to imagine Jake sounding like anything else. When Adventure Time ended its 10-season run in 2018, DiMaggio stood on a Comic-Con panel alongside the rest of the cast and admitted, in front of a room full of people, that he had wept after the final recording session. He said that he was going to miss how much Jake had become a part of him and how much of himself had become part of Jake. He said the drive home after that last session, he just burst into tears, and it shocked him because he hadn't realized how connected he actually was to the character until the connection was ending. That is not a small thing for a voice actor to say about a role, and it tells you something before we've even gotten to a single episode. Whatever Jake is, he was not simply a container for jokes. Real pieces of a real person went into building him, and evidently those pieces mattered enough that losing access to them, even just professionally, felt like a loss worth crying over on the drive home. On the surface, in the show itself, Jake exists mostly to make things easier. He cooks with a devotion that borders on ceremony, treating the making of a sandwich or a batch of biscuits as something closer to a sacred act than a chore. He naps in configurations that shouldn't be physically possible for a body with joints, curling and stretching himself into shapes that look less like sleep and more like a demonstration of what it means to be completely, totally at ease in your own skin, whatever shape that skin happens to be wearing that day. He gives Finn advice about girls that is, almost without exception, useless in its specifics. Girls, Jake tells Finn at one point, are like horses. When you fall off, you've got to get right back on a different horse. There's a lot of fish in the sea. It doesn't track. The metaphors don't hold together, and yet the general spirit underneath the garbled advice is usually pointed in the right direction, toward resilience, toward not staying down, toward trusting that things get better if you keep moving forward. He is wrong about almost every detail and right about almost every underlying truth, which, if you think about it, is a strange and specific kind of wisdom all its own. He has stretchy powers, the show's term for his ability to reshape, resize, and rearrange every part of his body, from stretching his arm across a room to becoming an entire house large enough for a family to live inside, to shrinking down, small enough to slip through a keyhole. He can rearrange his own internal organs when the situation calls for it, most memorably in an episode where he shrinks and relocates his organs and blood entirely into his own thumb to survive being bitten by Marceline, and in another where he enlarges his own liver 51 times its normal size, specifically to survive a poison that would otherwise have killed him. His body, in other words, is not fixed. It is closer to a suggestion than a fact, something he can renegotiate on the fly, depending on what the moment demands of him. And it is worth sitting with that for a second before we move any further, because it turns out to be one of the most quietly important facts about who Jake is. A creature whose body refuses to hold one form is, almost by necessity, going to develop a different relationship with identity than a creature whose body is fixed. If your shape is negotiable, then whatever you actually are has to live somewhere other than your shape. We'll come back to that. It matters more than it sounds like it should. For a long time, the show let Jake believe, and let the audience believe along with him, that he'd gotten his powers from something almost charmingly mundane. He thought, for years, that he'd simply rolled around in a magical mud puddle as a puppy and come out the other side able to stretch. It's the kind of origin story that fits Jake perfectly, an accident, something that happened while he was doing something aimless and pleasant, with no grand design behind it at all. The truth, when it eventually surfaced many seasons later, was considerably stranger and considerably darker, and we'll get to the full weight of that later in this video because it deserves its own space rather than a quick mention here. For now, just hold on to the fact that Jake spent most of his life believing a small sweet lie about where his powers came from, and that the actual truth, when it arrived, forced him to reckon with something much harder than a puppy rolling in mud. Before we go any further, I want to pause here because this is usually the point in one of these videos where I ask you to do something small. If you're watching this lying down in the dark with headphones on the way this channel is built for, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I like knowing that. There's something quietly moving about the idea of people in different time zones, different countries, different hours of the night, all sitting with the same dog at the same time in their own separate darknesses. It makes the exercise feel less solitary than it actually is. So tell me the place, tell me the time, and then let's keep going, because we've barely started peeling this one back. Jake's family life, the little of it the show ever directly addresses, is stranger and more layered than it first appears. He was raised by Joshua and Margaret, a pair of magical dogs who also took in an abandoned human infant named Finn and raised the two of them side by side as brothers. Joshua pushed his sons to be tough. Margaret tended to be more protective, more nurturing, the softer half of the parenting equation. Jake, by every account the show gives us, holds mostly fond memories of that upbringing, even though the full picture of what that household actually contained turned out to be far stranger than fond memories usually allow for. He has a brother, Jermaine, a natural-born son of Joshua and Margaret's, who grew up alongside Jake and Finn and who becomes important again much later in the show's run, in ways that tie directly back into the question of what Jake actually is underneath his familiar yellow shape. According to the mythology, the show eventually built out in an episode called Joshua and Margaret Investigations, and its sequel, The First Investigation. Jake's origin is not simply that Joshua and Margaret had a puppy the ordinary way. Joshua, while investigating a case involving stolen pies with his pregnant wife Margaret, was attacked by a strange, multi-eyed, shape-shifting creature that bit him on the head. That bite produced a boil, a pustule, on Joshua's skull, and Jake was born out of that pustule. Not born in any recognizable, biological sense that most families would claim on a form somewhere, but born nonetheless, brought into the world through his father's body, carrying something that wasn't fully his father's own. Joshua and Margaret took the strange new arrival and simply raised him alongside their other son, Jermaine, as if that were the most natural thing imaginable, which, in the specific moral universe of Adventure Time, it more or less was. Family, in this world, has never been strictly about biology. It has always been about who shows up and keeps showing up. Jake's origin story is, in miniature, the show's entire argument about chosen family playing out inside a single household years before anyone in the audience understood what it meant. The creature responsible for that bite, it would turn out many seasons later, was not simply some anonymous monster passing through Ooh. It had a name, a personality, and an agenda, and its reappearance in Jake's life, once he was fully grown with children of his own, produced one of the strangest and most quietly devastating stretches in the character's entire arc. We'll get there. For now, understand only this. Jake spent his entire childhood and most of his adulthood not knowing where his powers actually came from, believing instead in a gentler story about a puddle and a puppy And that gap between the story he believed and the truth waiting underneath it is one of the clearest examples of a pattern that runs through the whole of Adventure Time. Comfortable stories sit on top of uncomfortable truths all through this world, and Jake's own body is one of the places where that pattern is written most literally. Before Finn, before the treehouse, before any of the domestic warmth the show built its foundation on, Jake had another life entirely, and the show is surprisingly blunt about what that life involved. He was, in his own words and in the words of characters who knew him back then, a successful criminal. Not a petty troublemaker who occasionally shoplifted out of boredom, but the leader of his own gang, someone who by his own admission stole old ladies' purses, hawked stolen bikes, and was, according to one of his former associates in the episode Dentist, aiming to become a powerful mob boss before Finn ever entered his life. In the episode One Last Job, Jake reunites with his old criminal crew, Gareth, the Flying Lettuce Brothers, and Tiffany to pull off one final heist, in this case to rescue his own daughter, Jake Jr., from danger, which tells you something interesting right there about how thoroughly Jake integrated his past into his present, rather than pretending it never happened. He didn't erase that version of himself. He simply built a different life on top of it and kept the old skill set on hand in case it was ever needed for something that actually mattered. This is not a minor detail dressed up for edginess. It runs through the character consistently, in small and mostly comic ways, throughout the entire run of the show. He steals things, sometimes without fully registering that he's doing it, a kind of muscle memory left over from a life he otherwise walked away from. In the episode Ghost Princess, he takes valuables from a graveyard and, when confronted, offers the explanation that he simply didn't know it was wrong, which is either an admission of genuine confusion or a very old habit that never quite got fully retrained, and the show leaves the ambiguity sitting there rather than resolving it neatly. In an early episode, Susan Strong, he suggests, half-jokingly, that they could rule over the people they've just met like gods, angry gods specifically, a line that carries a little more weight once you know what kind of life he used to lead before Finn showed up. He is not written as a redeemed criminal in the dramatic, tortured sense that word usually implies in fiction. He's written as someone who simply changed direction, the way a person changes direction, gradually and imperfectly, occasionally reverting for a flicker of a moment before catching themselves and coming back. It's worth noting, too, that the show never asks the audience to feel particularly alarmed about any of this. A children's animated series admitting outright that one of its two central, beloved protagonists once ran a criminal gang and aspired to become a mob boss is, on paper, a genuinely bold thing to include without softening it into something more palatable. Adventure Time doesn't soften it much. It simply folds the information in as fact, delivered mostly through offhand lines and old associates reappearing for a scene or two, and trusts its audience, including the considerable number of younger viewers who made up a large share of its original broadcast audience, to hold that fact alongside their existing affection for Jake without either one canceling the other out. That trust, extended consistently across the whole run of the show toward viewers of every age, is part of why Adventure Time earned the kind of long-term critical and cultural respect it did. It never assumed its youngest viewers needed the world simplified for them. It assumed they could hold complexity, the way most children actually can, far better than adults sometimes give them credit for. What actually caused that change of direction, the show never fully explains in a single dedicated episode. It doesn't need to. The explanation is Finn. It is right there in the shape of Jake's entire adult life. A criminal who was, by his own account, well on his way toward becoming something considerably worse than a small-time thief, found himself raising an abandoned human child alongside his family, and something about that responsibility, that specific and unglamorous daily obligation to another living creature who depended on him, reoriented the whole trajectory of who he was going to become. He retired from crime to take part in what the record calls a more respectable life as an adventurer, and eventually settled down with Lady Rainicorn to become a father 5 times over. The show never frames this as a redemption arc, with a clean before and after. It frames it as something closer to the truth of how most people actually change, which is slowly, unevenly, with the old self still occasionally visible underneath the new one, showing up in a stolen trinket here or a suggestion about ruling as angry gods there, before receding again beneath the version of Jake who spends his days making biscuits and telling his best friend that home is wherever the people who care about you happen to be standing. There's an episode early in the show's run, one of its very first season entries, called Evicted, that on the surface is simply about Finn and Jake losing their treehouse to Marceline, the vampire queen, and going out to find a new place to live. It's also, quietly, one of the earliest and clearest statements of Jake's actual philosophy, delivered the way Jake delivers almost everything important, wrapped inside something silly enough that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. As Finn grows increasingly frustrated during their house hunt, missing the home they've lost, Jake picks up his viola and sings him a little song. Home isn't a place, he tells Finn. Home is anywhere where people care about you. Home is where your heart is. And where is your heart, Finn? It's right here inside you when I'm sitting here beside you. It's a throwaway musical bit in a 10-minute episode from the very beginning of the series, the kind of thing you'd expect to forget 5 minutes after watching it. And yet it turns out to be one of the truest things Jake ever says in the entire run of the show, a thesis statement disguised as a joke, delivered years before the show had built up enough emotional infrastructure for the audience to fully register how much weight it was actually carrying. Home isn't a place, it's the people who show up and keep showing up. Everything else Jake believes, all the way through to the end of his life, is really just an elaboration on that one small song sung to a scared kid in a cave. Now we get to the part of Jake's philosophy that people quote the most, the line that has genuinely escaped the show entirely and taken up residence in motivational posters, graduation speeches, and the kind of internet, quote, graphics people share when they're trying to encourage a friend through something difficult. Dude, sucking at something is the first step to being sorta good at something. It's become, by a wide margin, the single most quoted line Jake ever delivers, repeated by writers, coaches, teachers, and strangers on the internet who may have never watched a full episode of the show and simply encountered the, quote, floating free of its original context. And it's worth sitting with why that particular sentence, out of everything Jake ever says, is the one that escaped. Part of it is the specific, deliberately imprecise language. Not the first step to being good at something, but sorta good. Jake never overpromises. He doesn't tell you that struggle leads to mastery or excellence or greatness, the kind of vocabulary that self-help books lean on because it sounds impressive. He tells you it leads to being sorta good, which is a much smaller, much more honest claim, and paradoxically, a much more encouraging one because it's actually achievable. You don't have to become excellent to satisfy Jake's standard. You just have to move from actively bad at something to adequately fine at it, which is a bar almost anyone can clear if they're willing to keep going long enough to clear it. There's a companion piece to this quote that gets shared less often, but carries just as much weight. To live life, you need problems, Jake says. If you get everything you want the minute you want it, then what's the point of living? That's not a small thing for a cartoon dog to say. That's a fairly complete philosophy of meaning packed into 2 sentences. The idea that difficulty isn't an obstacle standing between you and a good life, but one of the actual load-bearing components of a good life in the first place. Remove the problems, and you haven't improved the life. You've hollowed it out. There's another quote, less famous but arguably more useful, that Jake offers in a different context. You're getting hung up on imaginary problems. You gotta focus on what's real, man. This is Jake's version of something Stoic philosophers spent centuries trying to articulate with considerably more words and considerably less charm. The idea that most of human suffering comes not from what's actually happening, but from what we're imagining might happen, might have happened, or might mean about us as people. Jake, without ever having read a word of philosophy, without any interest in reading a word of philosophy, arrives at more or less the same conclusion the Stoics arrived at, purely by paying attention to his own life and the lives of the people around him. Worry about the sandwich in front of you, not the sandwich that might theoretically go wrong 3 sandwiches from now. It sounds absurd, phrased that plainly, and it is a little absurd, and it is also, when you actually try to live by it, extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily useful advice. I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of claim that's easy to overstate. Adventure Time was not, as far as any confirmed account of its production goes, deliberately built as a vehicle for Stoic or Buddhist philosophy. There's no interview on record where Pendleton Ward or the writing staff describe consciously encoding ancient philosophical traditions into a talking dog's dialogue. This is an interpretation, a way of reading the character that a lot of viewers and critics have arrived at independently over the years. Not a confirmed authorial intention, and I want to label it clearly as exactly that. A reading, not a fact. But it's a reading that holds up remarkably well under scrutiny, because the practical content of what Jake advocates for, presence, acceptance of things you can't control, finding contentment in ordinary pleasures rather than chasing some imagined future state of satisfaction, tracks so closely with those older traditions that the resemblance is hard to write off as pure coincidence, even if it was arrived at instinctively by writers drawing on their own lived observations about what actually makes people functional and happy, rather than through any deliberate study. What makes Jake's version of this philosophy different from a self-help book and considerably more convincing is that the show never presents him as someone who arrived at wisdom and now simply dispenses it from a place of achieved enlightenment. He is still, throughout the entire run of the show, distractible, occasionally selfish, occasionally lazy, in ways that genuinely inconvenience the people around him, still capable of stealing things without registering that he's doing it, still liable to give advice that is wrong in almost every specific detail, even when it's right in its general spirit. His wisdom isn't a finished state. It's a practice, something he's actively doing rather than something he's completed. And the show is honest about the gap between what Jake believes and how consistently Jake manages to live up to what he believes. That gap, that ongoing imperfect practice rather than a tidy finished philosophy, is probably the single biggest reason the character has aged as well as he has. Nobody trusts a wise person who never struggles. Everybody, on some level, trusts a struggling person who's figured out 1 or 2 true things and keeps trying to apply them, imperfectly, one day at a time. There's a moment worth pulling out here that shows this practice in action rather than just in speech from the episode Daddy Daughter Card Wars. Jake, playing a card game with his daughter Charlie, finds himself slipping into old competitive habits. The aggressive, immature tendencies of his younger self resurfacing in a context where they're completely out of proportion to what's actually at stake. He knows it's happening. He's aware, in real time, that he's regressing into an old pattern he thought he'd left behind, and the show doesn't let him snap out of it cleanly through sheer force of self-awareness. It takes his daughter's help, a small act of patience and correction from someone he's raising, for him to actually get past it. This is a small, easily overlooked episode, but it captures something essential about how Jake's growth actually works throughout the show. It isn't a single transformation that happens once and holds forever. It's a recurring negotiation, sometimes one with help from people who love him, sometimes lost for a scene or two before being won again. That is a far more honest picture of what personal growth actually looks like than almost anything else you'll find in children's television, and it's worth noticing how quietly the show slips it in inside what is otherwise a fairly silly episode about a card game. Now, we arrive at one of the strangest and, I think, one of the most genuinely important stretches of Jake's entire story, a run of episodes that starts with a miniseries called Elements and continues into a season 9 episode called Abstract, in which Jake, quite literally, stops looking like Jake. Following the events of the Elements miniseries, Jake emerges transformed. Gone is the familiar, rounded, yellow, dog-shaped body the audience has spent years watching lounge across couches and stretch through doorways. In its place is something blue, five-eyed, angular, and unmistakably other, a design that echoes, though nobody in the show says so directly at first, the shape-shifting creature that fathered him all those years ago through that strange bite on Joshua's head. Finn can barely look directly at him. BMO is visibly frightened. Jake himself insists, over and over, with increasing defensiveness, that nothing has changed, that he's the same old Jake, completely normal, even as wings sprout involuntarily from his back, and his body warps into shapes he clearly did not choose, and cannot fully control. What follows in the episode Abstract is one of the most genuinely strange and genuinely moving sequences the show ever produced. Jake, unsettled by what's happening to his body, has a dream, a shared, strange dream that also involves his brother Jermaine, full of imagery of a statue coming to life, worshippers, and a stone slab. When he wakes, he becomes fixated on the idea that something has gone wrong with Jermaine specifically, because in the dream, Jermaine, previously established as someone who painted nothing but conventional landscapes, is shown creating abstract art instead. Jake tracks Jermaine down, convinced his brother has been possessed, corrupted, or fundamentally altered in some way that needs to be fixed and reversed. What he finds instead is a brother who has simply changed, deliberately, comfortably, and completely without alarm. Jermaine explains it to him with a calm that Jake initially can't accept. "There's nothing wrong with me, Jake," he says. "I just changed a little. You seem like you've changed a little bit too." Jake denies it, insists nothing is different, morphs involuntarily into a dragon-like shape even as he's making the claim, which is its own kind of visual joke about the gap between what we tell ourselves and what's actually visible to everyone around us. And Jermaine, patient in a way that Jake himself usually is with other people but struggles to be with himself in this moment, keeps gently pushing back. "No one is making me do this. Jermaine tells him. I painted so many landscapes that the shapes of the land began to lose their meaning, and the shapes broke apart to me, so I painted them like that. And it's not like my new paintings erase my old paintings. They're both me. And then comes the line that, more than almost anything else in the entire run of Adventure Time, feels like it's speaking directly to the audience rather than just to Jake. The shapes are always changing, Jake eventually says, working through it himself, arriving at Jermaine's understanding on his own terms. Changing is their normal state, like us. Even if we're not changing on the outside, we're changing on the inside constantly. There's some stuff about me that I've been ignoring for a long time. I'm afraid of that stuff, but it's part of who I am. As long as I know the shape of my soul, I'll be all right. Sit with that phrase for a second. The shape of my soul, not the shape of my body, which for Jake has never been fixed anyway, and not even the shape of his personality, which is itself constantly shifting in small ways as he ages, has children, loses people, gains new understanding of where he actually came from. The shape of his soul, something underneath all of that, something that persists through every transformation his body or his circumstances put him through. This is, in essence, Jake's entire answer to the question that haunts so much of Adventure Time's mythology, a show absolutely saturated with characters who lose themselves, who get possessed, transformed, mutated, or slowly erased by circumstances beyond their control. Simon Petrikov loses himself so completely to a cursed crown that 1,000 years pass before anyone can find the man underneath the Ice King again. The Lich is an ancient force wearing whatever body happens to be convenient. Even Gunter, the penguin, turns out to be an ancient cosmic entity compressed down into something small and forgetful. Identity in the land of Oo is almost never stable, and Jake, alone among the show's major characters, seems to have arrived at a genuinely workable answer to that instability well before it's ever fully tested against him. Know the shape of your soul, and the shape of your body becomes something you can hold more loosely. Once Jake returns home, having found this understanding through his brother's calm acceptance of his own transformation, his body reverts to its familiar yellow form. But the episode doesn't frame this reversion as the point. The point was never getting back to normal. The point was realizing that whatever normal even meant, underneath the shape, the actual Jake had never been in any danger of disappearing at all. This whole stretch of story becomes considerably more layered once you understand exactly where Jake's shape-shifting powers actually come from. A mystery the show had been quietly seeding for years before finally paying it off, very close to the series' actual end. In a two-part story, told across the episodes, The First Investigation and Jake the Star Child. The truth, when it finally arrives, is this. The creature that bit Joshua's head all those years ago, the one Jake believed for most of his life, had simply given him powers through some vague magical accident, was in fact his biological father. A shape-shifting, extra-dimensional being named Warren Ampersand, who had been observing Jake from a distance for essentially his entire life, watching him grow up without ever revealing himself, until Jake was fully an adult with 5 children of his own. When Warren finally does reveal himself, he appears cheerful, almost giddy, claiming he simply wants to reconnect with his son before it's too late, because he's dying. He whisks Jake away to his home planet, a place called Nera, which, if you say it backward, spells his own name, a detail the show plants without comment, letting the audience arrive at the implication of duplicity on their own before the episode confirms it outright. Warren shows Jake an entire museum built in his honor. He tells him he's the subject of a great prophecy, that he's destined to defeat a terrible tentacle monster and save an entire civilization. He hands Jake a belt to wear, marked Galaxy Savior, while he himself wears one marked Proud Pop. It has all the shape of a reunion story, the estranged father finally reaching out, the son given the chance to matter cosmically in a way his ordinary life back on U never quite offered him. And it is, every bit of it, a lie. There is no civilization on Nera. There are no citizens, no prophecy, no tentacle monster. The entire planet is Warren himself, stretched and shapeshifted into buildings and crowds and cheering onlookers. An elaborate, staged performance built for one purpose only, to trick Jake into stretching his powers to their absolute limit through belts that were secretly draining his life force the entire time. Warren has done this before, hundreds of times, to hundreds of other children, all of them drained and discarded once their power had been siphoned away to keep him young. Jake was never going to be the exception. He was simply the latest in a long line of offspring who existed, as far as Warren was concerned, purely as a renewable resource. What makes this story land as hard as it does is a single, quiet admission Warren makes partway through, almost as an aside. He tells Jake he never felt guilty about doing this before, not with any of the others. But something about Jake specifically, something Warren doesn't fully understand and can't fully explain, has made this particular betrayal harder for him than all the others put together. He wonders aloud if maybe it's because Jake is cooler than his other children. Or maybe, he says, almost as if the word is unfamiliar in his own mouth, it's this feeling your kind calls guilt. Jake defeats him, ultimately, by turning Warren's own trick back on him, swapping their belts so that Warren's continued use of his own powers ends up draining himself instead of his son. He tosses his own biological father into a black hole, and as Warren falls, accepting his fate with something almost like relief, he offers one last piece of dark comedy dressed as an epiphany. I see now, this fleshy form has taken me as far as it can. I'm going 4D, baby. And Jake, left alone on the wreckage of what used to be an entire fake planet built solely to deceive him, delivers the line that closes the whole arc. Bye, Warren Ampersand, he says. Thanks for reminding me what it means to be a good dad by being the worst dad ever. Never even got a pretzel. That last detail, small and almost thrown away, the missing pretzel, is exactly the kind of thing Adventure Time does better than almost any other show that's ever attempted this particular tonal register. A moment of real, cosmic betrayal, a father who fed on his own children for eons, closed out with a joke about snack food, because that's how grief and absurdity actually coexist in real life, layered right on top of each other, rather than politely taking turns. Some critics, reviewing this episode when it aired, felt that it resolved the long-teased mystery of Jake's parentage too quickly and too neatly, packed into a single 11-minute episode after nearly 4 seasons of quiet foreshadowing, and that criticism has some fairness to it. This is a case where I want to be honest about the reception rather than pretend the episode was universally beloved. Several reviewers pointed out that the emotional beats felt rushed, that Warren himself came across as a somewhat thin antagonist for the weight of what he represented, and that the show, by that point in its run, was clearly working against the limited time it had left before the series concluded entirely. All of that is fair criticism. And it's worth naming plainly rather than pretending every corner of this show landed perfectly. But even granting all of that, the core emotional content underneath the rushed execution still does real work. What Jake learns, in the end, isn't really about Warren at all. It's about the difference between the parent who happened to give him his powers and the parents who actually raised him. Warren Ampersand is his biological father in the most technical, almost incidental sense, a source of DNA and nothing more. Someone who watched from a distance for decades and only intervened once there was something to extract. Joshua and Margaret, the magical dogs who found him as whatever he was in that pustule and simply decided, without hesitation, to raise him alongside their other children, are his actual parents in every way that has ever mattered to Jake's life. And by the time this whole strange, almost science fiction detour through Jake's biology finally resolves, the show has quietly reaffirmed something it had been arguing since its very first season, back when a small child named Finn was found abandoned in the woods and simply taken in without a second thought. Blood is not what makes a family in the land of Ooh. Showing up is what makes a family. Everything else is just biology. And biology, in this show's moral universe, is almost always the least interesting thing about anyone. Before we move on from family, it's worth pausing on Jermaine a little longer because he functions as one of the quietest and most useful contrasts the show ever builds around Jake, precisely by being so unremarkable next to him. Jermaine is Joshua and Margaret's naturally born son, raised in the same house, under the same two parents, and yet he grows into someone almost entirely opposite to his brother in temperament. Where Jake drifts, adapts, and eventually settles into an easy, expansive kind of contentment, Jermaine spends long stretches of his life more anxious, more attached to rigid ideas about who he's supposed to be, more thrown by change when it eventually arrives for him too, as it does for everyone in this show sooner or later. His reappearance in abstract, calm and unbothered by his own artistic transformation from realist landscapes into something looser and more abstract, actually marks a real turning point for Jermaine himself, a character who by his own history had been considerably more rattled by uncertainty than his stretchy brother. In other words, Jake didn't teach Jermaine his philosophy directly, the way an older sibling might sit a younger one down and explain a lesson. He simply modeled it, patiently, across years of being the version of himself who could bend without breaking, until eventually, in his own time and by his own path, Jermaine found his way to something similar. That's a very Jake way for a lesson to spread, not delivered. Absorbed, slowly, by proximity, the way warmth moves from one object into whatever's sitting close enough beside it. It's also worth noting that both brothers, in their own ways, ended up estranged from the same biological threat without ever fully processing it together on screen, which the show leaves as an open thread rather than a tidy parallel arc. Warren Ampersand fathered them both through the same strange, parasitic act inflicted on Joshua, and yet the show is far more interested in Jake's reckoning with that fact than Jermaine's, mostly because Jake is the one whose entire physical existence, his stretchy powers, his shifting shape, his literal ability to become something other than himself at will, are the most direct inheritance from that encounter. Jermaine got to grow up ordinary, at least by Ooh's standards. Jake got to grow up carrying, quite literally in his own body, the walking evidence of where he actually came from, and had to make an active, repeated choice across years to define himself by the parents who raised him rather than the stranger who left something behind in his father's skull. That's not a small inheritance to make peace with, and it's easy to miss how much quiet work Jake had to do to arrive at the ease he carries by the time most viewers first meet him. Let's turn now to the part of Jake's life that occupies in raw screen time, probably more of the show than any single other thread of his story: his relationship with Lady Rainicorn, and his life as a father to their 5 children. Lady Rainicorn is, by the show's own design, a genuinely unusual character to build a long-running romance around, because she speaks almost exclusively in Korean throughout the entire series. This was a deliberate choice on the part of the creators, not a limitation worked around after the fact, and it's worth appreciating exactly how unusual that choice was for an American animated series broadcast primarily to an English-speaking audience. The show never gave her a universal translator, never resolved the language barrier with some convenient magical device, never made her fluent in English for the sake of narrative convenience. Jake, instead, learned Korean himself in order to speak with her, which is its own quiet statement about what real intimacy actually requires. Not that the other person adapts to make things easier for you, but that you do the work of meeting them where they actually are. Their relationship develops with a warmth that the show never rushes and never dramatizes more than it needs to. Jake meets her every day at 4 in the afternoon, on the dot, a small, unglamorous ritual of reliability that says more about the depth of his commitment than any grand romantic gesture could. In the episode, her parents, Lady's parents, are initially suspicious of Jake, a dog, and the show reveals that this suspicion isn't simple prejudice, but the residue of an actual historical conflict. The Rainicorn Dog Wars fought a generation or more earlier over the crystal dimension that is Lady's place of origin. It's a small piece of world building, easy to miss, but it does the work of grounding Jake and Lady's relationship inside something larger than just the two of them, a small act of reconciliation happening between two individuals that quietly, implicitly, closes a wound between two peoples. They have 5 children together: Charlie, Kim Kil-wan, TV, Viola, and Jake Jr., and the manner of their birth and growth is one of the strangest, and, once you actually sit with it, one of the most emotionally rich details in the entire show. Because of their Rainicorn parentage, the puppies age from infancy to full adulthood in a matter of days, sometimes within the span of a single episode. Jake experiences the entirety of fatherhood, in other words, radically compressed, living through what most parents experience across 2 decades in the space of what feels, from the outside, almost like a single long weekend. There is something worth noting about how differently this same compressed timeline could have been handled by a lesser show. It would have been easy, even understandable, to play the whole premise for tragedy: a father denied the ordinary decades most parents get to spend with their children, forced instead into a cruelly accelerated version of the same experience. Adventure Time never reaches for that version of the story. It treats the compression as simply another fact of Jake's particular life, no more or less strange than his shape-shifting or his criminal past, something to be lived through with the same easy adaptability he brings to everything else. The episode Jake the Dad handles this with a lightness that almost disguises how strange and how sad the underlying premise actually is. Jake watches his children grow up, essentially, before his eyes, with almost no time to plan, to adjust, to prepare himself for each new stage before the next one arrives and displaces it. And by the end of the episode, his children are adults, living lives of their own And Jake, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, is at peace with how quickly it all happened. Not because the speed didn't matter, but because he seems to understand, in whatever intuitive way Jake understands most things, that the specific length of time doesn't change the truth underneath it. Whether childhood lasts 18 years or 18 hours, the feeling of watching someone you love become someone new, someone who no longer needs you in the same way they used to, is fundamentally the same feeling either way. The show doesn't ask you to relate to the literal mechanics of rainicorn dog aging. It asks you to recognize the universal shape of watching time move differently when you're the one standing still, watching someone else grow through it. There's a detail here worth lingering on a little longer because it's easy to let it pass as simple world-building flavor rather than seeing it for what it actually is, which is one of the clearest illustrations in the entire show of what Jake's version of love actually asks of a person. Most romantic relationships in fiction, even ones the writers clearly care about, resolve the practical inconvenience of two characters not sharing a language within a scene or two, because language barriers are narratively expensive to maintain and easy to write around. Adventure Time simply never did that with Jake and Lady. For the entire run of the series, and by extension for the entirety of Jake's adult life, he understood his partner in a language his audience mostly couldn't follow along with, meaning that a huge percentage of what actually passed between them in private, day after day, existed slightly outside the reach of anyone watching. That's an unusual choice for a television romance to make and then simply never walk back. It suggests, again without the show ever stating it outright, that Jake's understanding of Lady was never really built primarily on words in the first place. Voice actor Nikki Yang, who plays Lady Rainicorn, has described the character as someone whose meaning comes through entirely in tone, warmth, and context rather than vocabulary. And that's exactly how the show asks its audience to understand her too, which means it's also exactly how Jake understood her. All along, underneath the Korean neither he nor most of his audience could translate word for word. Princess Bubblegum, notably, does understand Korean, one of the quieter details the show drops without comment that reveals just how close her friendship with Jake and Lady actually runs. Close enough that she took the trouble, at some point off-screen, to learn the language her friend's entire private life was conducted in. There's a smaller, quieter detail buried in Jake's family life that deserves its own moment here, because it shows something about how Jake processes his own past without ever making a production of it. His daughter Charlie, in the episode Daddy-Daughter Card Wars, is the one who helps him work through his old competitive aggression when it resurfaces during a simple card game. It's easy to miss the small poetry in that. The man who once ran a criminal gang, who once had ambitions toward becoming a mob boss, is gently corrected out of his darker instincts by his own child, not through some grand intervention, but through the ordinary, everyday friction of a family game night. That is, in miniature, the entire arc of Jake's adult life. The people he chose to build a family with became the mechanism through which his rougher edges kept getting sanded down, not because he demanded it of himself in some disciplined, deliberate way, but simply because that's what happens when you surround yourself with people you actually love and actually want to be better for. Now let's go somewhere darker and stranger, into an episode that, on its surface, is about a train, but underneath is about something considerably heavier: the difference between presence and escape, and what it cost to confuse the two. The episode Dungeon Train opens with Finn in a low place, recovering from his breakup with Flame Princess, describing his own state as feeling gray, like the little voice inside his head that usually gives him direction has gone quiet. Jake, trying to help in his characteristically imperfect way, tells Finn that girls are like horses, that you've got to get back on a different one, mixing his metaphors in a way that Finn fairly points out doesn't actually make sense as advice. And then the two of them stumble across a mysterious train that never seems to stop, each car inside it a self-contained dungeon full of monsters to fight, loot to collect, food and drink appearing whenever a fighter grows hungry or tired. It has all the appeal of an infinite video game, endlessly generating challenges and endlessly generating rewards. And Finn, still raw from his breakup, finds something in the rhythm of it that genuinely soothes him. The repetitive combat, the clear goals, the total absence of anything resembling the messy, unresolved feelings waiting for him back home. Jake grows bored almost immediately. He wants to leave. He's hungry. He's tired of fighting the same handful of monster types over and over, and he can sense, in a way that Finn can't yet sense about himself, that something about this place is starting to become less like recovery and more like avoidance. When Jake finds a future-seeing crystal dropped by one of the defeated enemies, what it shows him is genuinely frightening. An old, alone, hollowed-out version of Finn, still fighting on that same endless train decades later, having apparently spent his entire life on it, rather than ever going back to the life waiting for him outside. Jake shows this vision to Finn, expecting horror. Finn, still deep in whatever this place has hooked into him, responds instead with excitement. "I'm gonna have the best life," he says, focusing entirely on the ultra-powerful part of the vision and ignoring, or genuinely not registering, the soulless part sitting right alongside it. What finally breaks through isn't Jake's warning, and it isn't Finn's own good sense reasserting itself. It's a second detail in that same vision, one Jake almost misses entirely at first. Beside the old, hollow version of Finn in that terrible future, there is another figure, Jake himself, aged, worn down, still there. Still following his best friend through an endless, empty repetition of violence that stopped meaning anything to either of them years earlier, because that's what loyalty had apparently curdled into by that point. Staying, even after staying, had stopped being good for anyone. It's this detail, the sight of his own future self, still loyally, uselessly, tragically present at Finn's side inside a wasted life, that finally gets through to Finn, in a way none of Jake's earlier attempts could. He realizes he's been neglecting the actual cost of what he's doing, not just to himself, but to the person who has never once left his side. Finn doesn't leave the train immediately, even then. He tells Jake he needs another week or two, that he's not ready to fully let go of what the train has been giving him. But he does let Jake go home, promising he'll follow once he's actually worked through whatever this was standing in for. And Jake, before leaving, looks into the future crystal one more time, and this time it shows something entirely different, something small and ordinary, by the standards of everything else in this episode, almost embarrassingly modest. Just the two of them, back home, doing the dishes together. "Yeah, man," Jake says. "That's what I'm talking about." I want to dwell on that ending for a second longer than the episode itself does, because it's doing something quietly important about what Jake actually values. He isn't chasing excitement. He isn't chasing power, or loot, or the endless dopamine hit of one more fight against one more monster. What genuinely satisfies him, what he holds up at the very end of the episode as the actual goal worth wanting, is the two of them, together, doing an unglamorous domestic chore in an ordinary kitchen. Some critics and viewers who've written about this episode over the years have read it explicitly as a story about addiction, about the way certain kinds of stimulation can start substituting for genuine connection and genuine healing, offering the shape of relief without any of its substance. And I think that reading holds up well, though it's worth being clear that this is an interpretation rather than something the show states outright in so many words. What's not up for interpretation is what Jake wants, because the show tells us directly, in his own words, at the very end of the episode. Not the endless train, the dishes, the ordinary, repeated, unglamorous presence of being with someone he loves in a moment that will never be remembered as special, precisely because moments like that are the actual substance of a good life, rather than the exception to it. This is Jake's version of enlightenment, if you want to use that word, though I'd use it carefully given that nothing in the show frames it in explicitly spiritual terms. It isn't a mountaintop. It isn't a single, transformative realization that changes everything at once. It's dishes. It's sandwiches. It's the 4 o'clock meeting with Lady Rainicorn, day after day, on the dot. It's the accumulated weight of small, repeated, unremarkable acts of presence stacked up over years that end up meaning more than any single dramatic gesture ever could. Jake never says this explicitly as a unified philosophy, because Jake doesn't think in unified philosophies, but if you watch closely enough, across enough episodes, you can see the same underlying value showing up again and again, in a card game, in a kitchen, in a viola song about home not being a place. The ordinary is not a lesser version of the meaningful. It is where the meaningful actually lives. There's a smaller episode, easy to overlook among the show's louder mythology-heavy entries, that might actually be the purest single distillation of Jake's relationship to presence that the entire series ever produced. It's called Jake the Brick, and it aired in November of 2014 to an unusually warm critical reception for something with almost no plot at all. It won a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Short Format Animation the following year, which is a strange thing to say about an episode whose entire premise is that Jake wants to spend a day sitting motionless inside the brick wall of a collapsing shack just to see what it feels like to be a brick in that specific circumstance at the exact moment the shack finally gives out. Finn, to his enormous credit, doesn't try to talk him out of it or even fully understand it. He simply accepts that this is something Jake needs to do, leaves him a walkie-talkie in case he wants to talk, and heads home. What Jake ends up doing, once left alone with nothing but a wall, a bit of boredom, and eventually a small rabbit that emerges from a nearby burrow, is narrate. He starts describing, almost involuntarily, the small dramas of the natural world unfolding in front of him, the rabbit's home threatened by a coming storm, a family of beavers, and a passing sea creature who help reinforce the burrow, a bullying deer who tears it apart anyway, and finally, the rabbit's quiet, resourceful discovery of a new home inside a fallen, hollow tree trunk after the flood and the storm have both passed. Finn, without asking permission, patches the walkie-talkie feed into Oo's radio network, and by the episode's midpoint, nearly every character in the show's enormous cast is sitting somewhere, listening, captivated by the small, stakes-free story of one anxious rabbit's night. It would be easy to read this episode as pure whimsy, a low-stakes palate cleanser between heavier mythology arcs, and on one level, that's exactly what it is. But there's a reading worth taking seriously here too, one advanced by more than a few longtime viewers of the show over the years, that Jake's desire to be a brick, specifically a brick present at the exact moment of a structure's total collapse, isn't really about bricks at all. It's about wanting to know what it feels like to be there, fully and completely, for an ending. Jake has, elsewhere in the show, shown a genuinely striking lack of fear around his own mortality, more than once treating the prospect of his own death with something closer to curiosity than dread. In one earlier episode, facing what looks like certain death alongside Finn, he offers his friend nothing more dramatic than a promise to be waiting on the other side, ready to clap for him when he arrives. It's delivered as a joke, in the moment, the way Jake delivers almost everything. But jokes in this show are rarely just jokes, and this one sits comfortably alongside everything else we've traced about how thoroughly Jake made his peace with endings long before the show ever forced him to actually face one. By the end of Jake the Brick, the shack does eventually fall, but Jake has already stepped out of the wall by the time it happens, having decided, watching the rabbit's own quiet resilience play out in real time, that there was a bigger lesson sitting right in front of him than the one he'd originally set out looking for. He'd wanted to experience an ending in isolation. What he found instead, without particularly meaning to, was a small, unglamorous story about a community of animals helping each other rebuild after a loss broadcast by accident to an entire kingdom of listeners who needed, that particular evening, exactly that kind of gentle, uneventful company. Jake set out to practice being present for an ending alone. He ended up instead discovering that being present is really only ever valuable when there's someone else listening on the other end of the line. He calls Finn back on the walkie-talkie, tells him he's ready to come home, and that's the whole episode. No lesson stated outright, no moral delivered in a closing line. Just a dog, a brick wall, a rabbit, and an entire kingdom quietly listening in the dark, which, now that I say it out loud, might be the single most fitting possible description of what this whole channel has been trying to do for you as well. There is a detail worth adding here about how Jake actually fights, because even his relationship to combat carries the same underlying philosophy running through everything else about him. Series creator Pendleton Ward has said in interviews that Jake uses his powers lazily, that he rarely bothers to explore their full extent, even though he is, by his own repeated claims, many times stronger than Finn. He could, in theory, dominate almost any fight the show puts him in front of. He mostly doesn't. He leaves the brawling to Finn, saves his own effort for the moments that genuinely require it, and treats even his own considerable strength the way he treats most things, as something to be used when needed rather than flexed for its own sake. It's a small structural choice on the part of the writers, largely functional, meant to keep Finn as the show's primary combatant, rather than making every fight trivially easy for an overpowered secondary character. But it accidentally reinforces something true about who Jake is underneath the mechanics. Power, for Jake, was never really the point. He has access to more of it than almost anyone else in his immediate orbit, and he spends most of his life choosing not to reach for it, because reaching for it isn't where his actual attention wants to go. It's worth stepping back for a moment here and setting Jake's whole approach to impermanence against the other major examples the show gives us, because Adventure Time is, at its core, a show absolutely obsessed with what happens to people over long stretches of time, and it offers several very different answers to that question through several very different characters. Simon Petrikov lost himself almost entirely to a cursed crown, his personality slowly erased over 1,000 years until only fragments of the original antiquarian remained, buried under the Ice King's confusion and loneliness. Marceline survived that same 1,000 years by simply outliving everyone, carrying the accumulated weight of every loss without anyone else around who remembered what she remembered, playing her grief out through a bass guitar, because there was rarely anyone left to actually talk to about it. Princess Bubblegum built an entire kingdom, an entire population of candy people, essentially as a structure to keep herself occupied and needed, filling the silence left behind by the old world's collapse with an endless, self-imposed responsibility that never quite let her rest. Every one of those responses to loss and time is understandable. None of them are exactly healthy, and the show is honest enough to treat all three with real compassion rather than judgment, because losing yourself to a magical curse, or grieving alone for a millennium, or working yourself into the ground rather than sitting still with your own feelings, are all recognizable human ways of coping with more pain than any one person should reasonably be asked to hold. But Jake's answer sits apart from all three of those, and it's worth being precise about why. He doesn't lose himself because he decided early, without ever framing it in such grand terms, that whatever he actually was lived somewhere underneath his shifting shape, in the part abstract calls the shape of his soul, and he simply kept returning to that core over and over, no matter what form his life or his body happened to be taking at any given moment. He doesn't grieve alone, because he never let his relationships calcify into something too precious to touch, too important to risk changing. And he doesn't work himself into exhaustion trying to fill a silence, because he made his peace somewhere very early and very quietly with the fact that a life doesn't need to be filled wall to wall with purpose in order to be worth living. Some of it can just be a nap. Some of it can just be a sandwich, eaten slowly, appreciated fully, without needing to justify itself as part of some larger project. This isn't to say Jake's approach is presented as objectively superior to the others, some kind of answer key the other characters simply failed to find. The show never frames it that way, and I don't think it should be read that way either. Simon's loss was inflicted on him against his will by a cursed object he had no way of anticipating. Marceline's isolation was a function of literally outliving everyone she loved, a circumstance entirely outside her control. Bubblegum's compulsive productivity came from a genuinely traumatic origin, born into the wreckage of a collapsed world, with a responsibility for an entire species of beings she'd created herself. Jake, by contrast, got to choose his own response, largely because his own losses, while real, were smaller and less totalizing than what those other three characters were asked to survive. It would be too simple, and a little unfair to the weight of what Simon and Marceline and Bubblegum actually went through, to hold Jake up as proof that they could have just chosen differently. What I think is fairer to say is this. Jake represents one workable answer among several the show offers to the same underlying question: what do you do with a life you know is going to end? Surrounded by people you know you're eventually going to lose. His answer happens to be the gentlest one, the one that costs the least, and maybe that's exactly why it took the show and its audience the longest to notice it was there at all. Quiet answers are easy to miss next to 1,000 years of vampiric grief, or a crown that erases a man's whole personality. But quiet doesn't mean small. Sometimes it just means the kind of wisdom that doesn't need an audience to know it's true. Now, we have to talk about the thing that Adventure Time, true to its own nature, never says directly, and that its various follow-up projects have only gradually, painfully circled closer and closer to confirming over the years, Since the original series ended, Jake dies. The main series never shows this. Come Along with Me, the finale that aired in September of 2018, ends with its characters granted something closer to peace than resolution, a breath rather than a full stop. Jake is there, present, alive, part of the world as the show leaves it. It's in the material that came after, the Distant Lands specials, and later the Fiona and Cake spin-off series, where the evidence accumulates, quietly and without fanfare, that Jake's story eventually, inevitably, comes to an end. The way every mortal creature's story eventually comes to an end, magical, stretchy powers or not. The first clear piece of evidence sits in something almost too small to notice if you're not looking for it. A tattoo visible on Finn's chest in some of the expanded stories that take place after the original finale, depicting Jake, worn in the place directly over his heart. The show never announces what this means. It simply places the tattoo there and trusts the audience to draw the obvious, devastating conclusion on their own, the same way it trusted audiences years earlier to notice the ruins of an old world buried quietly in the backgrounds of unrelated episodes. A person doesn't typically tattoo a living friend permanently onto their own skin in that specific spot without some deeper reason behind it. The show gives you the fact and gives you the feeling and leaves the connecting of those two things entirely up to you. The Distant Lands special Together Again, one of 4 expanded specials that aired on HBO Max starting in June of 2020, addresses the aftermath of this loss directly, depicting a reunion between Finn and Jake that takes place unmistakably in some kind of afterlife. The animation style shifts for these sequences into something more surreal and abstract than the show's usual visual language, a clear signal that we've left the normal rules behind. The special treats the reunion as something genuinely joyful, without pretending that the grief of the separation preceding it was never real. It's a story that acknowledges loss in order to properly celebrate what survives it, rather than skipping past the loss entirely to get to the happy reunion faster. More recently, and this is genuinely new information relative to what most longtime fans discussing this topic had access to even a year or two ago, the Fiona and Cake spin-off series has moved from implication to something much closer to direct confirmation. Throughout the series, Jake is simply absent, and characters speak of him consistently in the past tense, a quiet, sustained signal that something has happened without the show ever stopping to explain what. Then, in the second season episode, The Worm and His Orchard, which premiered in December of 2025, the show finally gestures toward the moment itself. Fiona, exploring a strange realm called the Undergrowth alongside Fern, the grass being who serves as a kind of echo of Finn from the original series, encounters Finn's accumulated unprocessed trauma, represented visually as a tree covered in fruit, containing memories too painful for him to have ever properly worked through. The largest fruit on that tree, the heaviest, most unprocessed memory Finn carries, is revealed to be a memory of himself screaming Jake's name in what is clearly a moment of horror. Fern deliberately pulls Fiona away before she can see the full memory, telling her plainly that she really doesn't want to see that one. It's what television critics call an unreveal, a moment engineered to confirm that something devastating happened without ever showing the audience the specifics of what. We don't know how Jake died. We know only that it was traumatic enough that even decades later, in whatever form Finn's memory takes shape as inside this strange mythological realm, he still hasn't been able to fully look at it. The very next episode, The Bear and the Rose, which closed out that same season, pushes this thread to something even closer to a full resolution, at least on an emotional level. Amid a story about Finn's near death and eventual recovery, the show states plainly, as part of its own internal logic, that Finn was finally able to accept Jake's death, and to accept, alongside that acceptance, the love being offered to him by another character, Huntress Wizard, who he'd previously held at a distance. The two facts are placed side by side deliberately. Finn couldn't fully let someone new into his life until he'd found some way to make peace with the fact that Jake, the person who had been at his side for essentially every meaningful moment of his life up to that point, was truly and permanently gone. I want to be careful here about exactly what's confirmed and what remains speculative, because this is recent material, and the show has, at various points in its history, found ways to bring characters back from apparent death that would have seemed permanent under any other storytelling logic. The cosmic owl, in that very same season, is resurrected almost immediately after his death is confirmed, which the show itself treats almost as a running joke about how death functions differently for cosmic, idea-adjacent beings in this particular universe. Jake's death has not, as of the most recent material available, been reversed or walked back the way the cosmic owl's was. But given the show's specific history with mortality, and given that this is still an actively unfolding piece of media that could theoretically continue past the point of this video's release, it's worth holding this conclusion with appropriate humility. What we can say with confidence is that Jake died at some point after the events of the original finale, that the show has treated this death with weight and seriousness rather than as something to be casually reversed, and that Finn's arc, years later, is substantially built around learning to actually live with that loss rather than simply moving past it. There's something worth sitting with in the specific shape of how the show chose to handle this, across years and multiple separate productions, rather than simply resolving it in one clean, dramatic episode. It mirrors, almost exactly, the way grief actually works for most people in real life. Not a single cathartic scene that resolves everything at once, but a slow, cumulative process of small pieces of evidence and small acknowledgments arriving across years, each one adding a little more weight and a little more clarity until eventually the full shape of the loss becomes something you can finally actually look at directly, rather than only glimpsing sideways through a tattoo or a pain fruit too heavy to touch. And here, I think, is where Jake's entire philosophy actually gets tested against something real, rather than remaining a comfortable idea he never has to fully live out. Because everything we've traced through this video, the acceptance of change, the comfort with impermanence, the insistence on presence over anxiety, the conviction that home is a person rather than a place, all of that philosophy exists specifically to prepare someone for exactly this outcome. Jake was always going to die before Finn did, in every reasonable version of this story, because Jake is a dog, and dogs, magical or not, tend to have shorter lives than humans. And there's real evidence, scattered through the show, that Jake understood this and made his peace with it far earlier than the audience was ever asked to. In the episode Dungeon Train, that future crystal doesn't just show us Finn's possible fate, it shows us an aged, worn version of Jake as well, still present, still loyal, visibly older, and Jake's reaction to seeing his own aging isn't horror, it's concern for Finn, concern about what that future would mean for his friend, not fear for himself. Throughout the show, Jake is consistently the character least disturbed by his own mortality, the one who seems, more than anyone else in this world built on grief and loss, to have already made his peace with the fact that his time is limited, and that the appropriate response to that limitation isn't dread, but attention, a determination to actually be present for the days he does get, rather than spending them anxious about the days he won't. This is speculation, and I want to flag it clearly as speculation rather than confirmed text. But I think it's fair to read Jake's entire philosophy of presence, his insistence on savoring sandwiches and naps and small domestic rituals rather than chasing grand adventures for their own sake, as something that only makes complete sense once you understand what he was quietly preparing for the whole time. Not preparing Finn for an adventure, preparing him for a loss, teaching him one small, ordinary moment at a time across years that the sandwich matters, that the nap matters, that the 4 o'clock meeting matters, not because any of those things are individually significant, but because a life built out of enough small, attended moments becomes cumulatively a life that can survive losing even its most important person, because so much of what made that life good was never actually located in any single irreplaceable event to begin with. It was located in the practice of paying attention over and over to whatever was actually in front of him. Finn learned that practice from Jake across years of ordinary days. And when the day finally came that Jake wasn't there anymore, that practice, however imperfectly and however long it took him to actually access it, was the thing that eventually let Finn keep going. I keep coming back to that image from the future Crystal in Dungeon Train, the old, worn Jake, still loyally, uselessly following Finn through an empty, addictive repetition that had stopped meaning anything years earlier. The show frames that image as a warning, a bad outcome to be avoided. But I think there's a gentler reading sitting alongside the warning, one the show doesn't insist on but doesn't foreclose either. Even in that darkest possible future, even in the version of events where everything had gone wrong, where Finn had wasted his life chasing an endless, hollow substitute for real living, Jake was still there, still hadn't left. Whatever else that future got wrong, it got Jake's loyalty right, because Jake's loyalty was never conditional on things going well. That is, in the end, probably the single most consistent fact about the character across the entire 10-season run and everything that came after it. He shows up. He kept showing up for a criminal gang until he decided that wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. He kept showing up for Finn from childhood through old age. He kept showing up for 5 children who grew up faster than any parent should reasonably be asked to process. He kept showing up even for a version of himself that had temporarily turned blue and five-eyed and unrecognizable, refusing to let that transformation convince him he'd actually stopped being who he was underneath it. And in the end, according to the most recent chapters of this story, still being told, he kept showing up right up until there was nothing left of him to show up with anymore, leaving behind a friend who needed years, real years, measured in actual seasons of television, spread out over the better part of a decade before he could finally, fully look at what that loss actually meant. There's a particular kind of sadness in knowing that Jake, of all the characters in this show, the one who made the most consistent and most convincing peace with his own mortality, still left behind a friend who couldn't look directly at his death for years afterward. It suggests something important, something worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly. Jake's own peace with impermanence never guaranteed that the people who loved him would inherit that same peace automatically. Wisdom, even genuine, hard-won wisdom, doesn't transfer by proximity. Finn spent his entire childhood and adolescence next to someone who had figured out how to hold change and loss and mortality without being destroyed by them. And Finn still needed his own separate, much longer, much harder journey to arrive anywhere close to that same understanding for himself. Maybe that's the most honest thing this whole story ultimately has to say about wisdom in general. You can watch someone live it every single day for years. You can even love them for it. And you might still need your own catastrophe, your own version of standing in front of a tree full of pain fruit too heavy to look at directly before any of it actually becomes yours. There's one more relationship worth pulling into focus before we close, because it says something about Jake from an angle none of his human or magical relationships quite capture in the same way, and that's his role in BMO's life. BMO, the small, gendered, ambiguous, video game console-shaped member of the household, refers to Finn and Jake as their parents, and the show treats this claim with total sincerity rather than as a cute throwaway line. BMO was built to be a machine. Somewhere along the way, through nothing more dramatic than years of being included, talked to, played with, and loved the way you'd love any other member of a household, BMO became something considerably more than a machine, and Jake never once treated that development as strange or worth questioning. He simply extended the same easy, unconditional inclusion to BMO that he'd extended to Finn as an abandoned human infant found in the woods. The same inclusion Joshua and Margaret had once extended to him. This matters because it shows the pattern operating at its widest possible radius. Jake's capacity for found family isn't limited to beings who look roughly like him or who share some recognizable emotional architecture with him. It extends outward to a small robot whose entire nature remains genuinely ambiguous even by the show's own admission, a character the show itself never fully categorizes within its elaborate cosmology of dogs and demons and candy people and ancient comets. BMO doesn't fit anywhere on that chart, and nobody in the tree fort ever seemed to think that mattered. What mattered was that BMO showed up day after day, playing games, cooking with Jake, singing songs, being present in exactly the unglamorous, ordinary way that Jake has spent this entire video demonstrating is the actual substance of love as opposed to its more dramatic imitations. Family, in Jake's world, was never a checklist of qualifying traits. It was a practice, open to absolutely anyone willing to keep showing up for it, dog, human, robot, or otherwise. I want to circle back now to something I mentioned much earlier in this video and set aside because I think it deserves to be picked back up here at the end where it finally has the full weight of everything else behind it. John DiMaggio, describing his own relationship to this character, said that a lot of himself went into Jake, and that losing access to the role felt, on some real level, like losing a part of himself. I don't think that's an accident, and I don't think it's simply sentimental award show language either. Jake, more than almost any other character in this show, was built out of genuinely small, genuinely human material. Not cosmic mythology, not tragic backstory, delivered in dramatic monologues, but sandwiches, naps, terrible advice, delivered with total sincerity, a criminal past, quietly folded into a domestic present, a father who experienced his children's entire childhoods in the space of a few compressed days, and somehow still found a way to be at peace with how fast it all went. Jake is, in the end, the character in Adventure Time who feels most like an actual person you might know, rather than a symbol standing in for some larger cosmic idea. And maybe that's exactly why an actor could pour so much of himself into the role, and why an audience, watching for 10 years, and then following the character's story even further across specials and spin offs has kept coming back to him with an affection that doesn't quite match how the show marketed him at the start, as the funny sidekick standing next to the actual hero. It's worth noting that DiMaggio's relationship to this character didn't end when the original series did either, which is itself a small, real world echo of everything Jake stands for inside the show. When Adventure Time Distant Lands arrived on HBO Max in 2020, DiMaggio was there. When the prequel series Adventure Time Side Quests premiered in 2026, built around a young Finn, now voiced by a new actor since Jeremy Shada had aged out of the part, DiMaggio returned once again as Jake, working alongside the new, younger cast member to help pass along the specific rhythm and chemistry the character had always shared with his human brother. In interviews around that production, DiMaggio spoke about the process of recording scenes together with his young co-star specifically, so the newcomer could absorb the feeling of what that friendship was supposed to sound like, even in scenes they'd eventually have to record apart. That is, in its own quiet, entirely unglamorous, real-world way, exactly the same thing Jake spent an entire animated childhood doing for Finn. Not lecturing him toward wisdom, but simply being present often enough, consistently enough, that some of it rubbed off by proximity, ready to be carried forward into scenes DiMaggio himself might not even be standing in the room for. Because here, at the bottom of everything we've covered tonight, is the thing I think is actually true about Jake. The thing that took the show its full run and several years of follow-up material to fully reveal, and that I don't think it's fully finished revealing even now. He was never really the sidekick. He was the demonstration. Finn is the hero of Adventure Time in the traditional sense, the one with the sword, the one whose goodness the show's own cosmology eventually reveals to be something like a cosmic principle given human shape. But Jake is the show's argument for how to actually survive being alive in a broken, strange, impermanent world without either hardening into cynicism or shattering under the weight of everything that gets lost along the way. Make peace with change, because your own body will change on you eventually, one way or another. Make peace with your past, because it made you who you are even after you've moved past it, and pretending otherwise doesn't make you more whole. It just makes you less honest. Find your family in the people who show up for you, not the ones biology happens to hand you. Pay attention to the sandwich in front of you, because the sandwich in front of you is, in the final accounting, most of what a life actually consists of. And when the ending finally comes, and it always finally comes, meet it the way you met everything else. Present, unafraid, still yourself, whatever shape you happen to be wearing when it arrives. There's a version of this video that could have led with the mythology, with Warren Ampersand and cosmic prophecies and the strange biology of a dog born from a pustule on his father's head, because that material is genuinely fascinating and genuinely underappreciated by casual viewers of the show. But I wanted to save it for the middle, buried inside the ordinary texture of sandwiches and card games and 4 o'clock appointments, because that's actually how it sits inside Jake's own life too. The cosmic weirdness was always there, running underneath everything, the same way the Mushroom Wars ruins sit quietly in the background of nearly every outdoor scene this show ever animated. But Jake never let the weirdness become the point. He absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything else that happened to him, and kept right on making sandwiches, kept right on showing up at 4 o'clock, kept right on being exactly as present for an ordinary Tuesday as he was for a fight against an ancient shape-shifting parasite pretending to be his father. That refusal to let the extraordinary overwhelm the ordinary might be the single most instructive thing about him. More instructive, honestly, than any individual quote about sucking at something or focusing on what's real. Life is going to hand you cosmic strangeness eventually, in one form or another, whatever shape it happens to take in your own particular world. Jake's whole example suggests that the goal was never to avoid that strangeness. It was to make sure it never became bigger than the sandwich. That's Jake. That's the whole philosophy. Worked out not in a classroom or a monastery, but in a treehouse, across a decade of biscuits and naps and terrible advice about horses by a stretchy yellow dog who used to steal old ladies' purses and ended up, somehow, without ever seeming to try very hard at it, becoming one of the wisest characters animation has ever produced. He never called it wisdom. He would probably have been embarrassed if you'd called it that to his face. He just called it Tuesday, or dinner, or 4 o'clock, or the specific unglamorous joy of doing the dishes with someone you love after a hard week. And maybe that's exactly the point. The realest wisdom rarely announces itself as wisdom while it's happening. It just looks like someone quietly, consistently, imperfectly showing up for as long as they're given to do it. We covered a lot of ground tonight, from a puddle of mud that never actually explained anything, to a pustule on a father's head that explained entirely too much, to a card game with a daughter that quietly did more repair work than any lecture could have, to a train that never stops moving unless you choose to step off it yourself. All of it circles back to the same small, patient center. A dog who figured out, long before anyone around him did, that the shape of a life matters less than the shape of the soul living inside it, and who spent every day he was given, proving that lesson through nothing more dramatic than showing up again and again for the people he had chosen. If this video gave you something to sit with, I'd genuinely love to know what it was. Drop a comment and tell me which part of Jake's philosophy actually landed for you. The sandwich, the dishes, the shape of his soul, or something else entirely that I didn't even fully manage to name tonight. This channel exists because there's so much more sitting underneath this show than its surface ever lets on, and I plan on keeping on digging into it for as long as there's more to find, which, with a world built the way the land of Ooh is built, might genuinely be forever. So if that sounds like something you want to keep coming back to, consider subscribing and hit like if tonight's trip down into Jake's particular corner of Ooh was worth the time. The land of Ooh will keep. It's been keeping for 1,000 years already, and so, I think, will he, in whatever form the shape of his soul takes next. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, I hope some part of this settled into you the way the good parts of this show always seem to settle, quietly, without announcing themselves, waiting to be noticed on some ordinary evening, long after the episode has ended. Rest well tonight. There's more down here whenever you're ready to come looking for it.